welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
So today, we're really diving into something pretty significant, turning tides, Canada's political shift and its global implications.
Yeah, it feels like a real moment of change.
It does. We've got some really interesting analysis here. Stuff looking at Canada's recent election, obviously, but also how that ties into the U.S. relationship, which is, well, complicated right now.
Understatement, maybe.
And also a big shift in Arctic strategy. Defense, foreign policy, the whole nine yards.
Absolutely.
So our mission, if you will, is to kind of cut through all that complexity, pull out the key insights for you, and help make sense of these big changes and, why they actually matter globally.
Right. And we're looking at analysis from places like the Wilson Center. They've got a specific take on the election and U.S. relations, and also this really detailed, edited volume on the new Arctic stuff.
Exactly. Okay, so where do we start? The election seems like the natural jumping off point.
I think so. And what's fascinating right off the bat is how that Wilson Center analysis puts it. They're basically calling the 2025 election a referendum on U.S.-Canadian relations.
Wow. Okay. So not just domestic issues then.
Not primarily, according to this view. It suggests the election was really about sending a message south, especially with all the U.S. tariffs that came in earlier in the year.
Right. I remember that. Early 2025, those tariffs hit. There was that initial across-the-board one, something about fentanyl concerns.
That was the justification given, yeah.
And then the steel and aluminum tariffs came back.
Right.
Plus all the background noise about potential reciprocal tariffs, dairy, the GST. It felt like a lot was happening on the trade front.
It really did. And, some people initially thought maybe those tariffs were like a tactic, a way to push for an early review of the USMCA.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. The trade deal context.
Exactly. And some of the initial tariff threats, especially around auto trade, got suspended based on USMCA rules of origin. So the agreement was definitely part of the picture.
But the election itself, it sounds like it took on a really nationalist tone.
Oh, massively. That's a key point from the analysis. You had both Carney, who won the Liberal leadership and then the election, and Poilievre, the Conservative leader, taking these incredibly strong stands, basically saying Canada will never be part of the U.S.
Yeah, I saw some of those quotes. Poilievre saying something like, "We'll bear any burden and pay any price to protect sovereignty."
Pretty strong stuff.
Very. And Carney was just as emphatic, wasn't he? America is not Canada, and Canada will never, ever be part of America.
In any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
And he called the idea crazy, full stop, when Secretary Rubio repeated Trump's comments about statehood.
Right. And you connect that to Trump's talk about using economic force. The Wilson Center piece notes, Canadians really saw that as the start of the pressure campaign.
And that reaction, the booing of the U.S. anthem at hockey games and stuff, that showed how deep that feeling went, didn't it? It really did. It underscored the sentiment. And Carney himself, he explicitly linked the election timing to dealing with Trump's tariffs in that post on X right before he called it.
So even though some of those initial tariffs were rolled back, the whole episode just fueled this nationalist feeling that dominated the campaign.
Seems that way. It was like a wake-up call about economic vulnerability, maybe?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And wasn't there something about Carney's first trip after winning the leadership? That was unusual, right?
Yeah, that was telling. He went to Paris and London first, broke that long tradition of heading straight to Washington.
Okay. What was the signal there?
Well, he said he intended to speak to Trump with mutual respect for sovereignty. So already kind of setting a different tone, or at least signaling a different priority list.
Interesting. Okay, so Carney wins the election. Then what?
Yeah.
We have some analysis from the Atlantic Council experts looking at the aftermath.
We do. And they offer a few different angles. Christopher Sands, for instance, he talks about Canada being united in that nationalist feeling, but still pretty divided politically underneath.
Okay, united and divided. Makes sense.
And he expects the U.S. to keep pushing on familiar issues, NATO spending, border security, critical minerals, the usual stuff.
But Dianne Francis, she frames the election result really bluntly, doesn't she?
Yep.
Like just a flat-out rejection of joining the U.S.
Yeah, she really hammers home that sovereignty point. It was central.
And Michael Bosierki, his take seems more about stability.
Right. He suggests Canadians wanted a steady hand, someone to, stand up to Trump, but also fix perceived economic issues. And he points out Carney needs to work with other parties, like the Bloc, to actually govern, which is important for the domestic side.
Then there's the international angle beyond the U.S. Imran Bayoumie's point about defense diversification.
Yeah, that's really interesting. He highlights Carney likely looking for defense deals with partners other than the U.S. That trip to France and the U.K., maybe rethinking the F-35s, buying that J-ORN radar from Australia.
You potentially working with South Korea on submarines. Plus the Nordic focus in the Arctic policy we'll get to. It suggests a real strategy of, well, not putting all the eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Especially given the uncertainty down south, those Arctic partnerships with Japan and South Korea suddenly look even more important.
And the regional divisions within Canada. Maya Gonzalez-Latour brings that up, right? The conservative wins in Alberta.
Crucial point. The U.S. tariffs hit blue-collar workers hard out west, especially in Alberta. So Carney's got this challenge of representing the whole country when economic pressures are hitting different regions differently, and the political map reflects that.
Which ties into what Donovan, Nicolodze, and de Cruyff were saying about needing better provincial coordination.
Yeah, they emphasize that Canada needs to speak with one voice economically. They point to Alberta wanting to use oil as a bargaining chip during the tariff spat, which didn't align with the federal approach. That lack of unity, well, it weakened Canada's hand.
Makes sense. And Reed Blakemore focuses on energy.
Yeah, energy and infrastructure. He argues they're still core to the U.S.-Canada relationship. Canadian energy matters for U.S. prices, for that whole North American energy dominance idea. So despite the tension, that interdependence is still a big factor.
Okay. And a couple other points. Mark Scott predicting a push on AI and social media regulation. Things may be put on the back burner before.
Seems likely.
And Layla Mashkour raising that red flag about Meta's news blackout during the election. That sounds worrying.
Definitely a troubling precedent for democracy, as she puts it. So yeah, the election fallout is complex. It touches trade, security, national unity, tech, pretty much everything.
Okay, so that's the political earthquake, if you like. But happening at the same time, Canada's making major moves up north in the Arctic.
Exactly. And that's the second big piece of this puzzle. We have this edited volume looking at the 2024 Defense Policy Update, our North Strong and Free, and the Arctic Foreign Policy that came out around the same time.
And the headline there seems to be, Arctic is priority number one.
That's what jumps out immediately. The defense policy flat out says asserting Arctic sovereignty is the most urgent and important task facing Canada.
Wow. Most urgent and important. That's a statement. How does that compare to past policies?
It's a big shift. The Arctic foreign policy echoes it, talking about strong Canadian leadership, presence, partnerships. If you look back, like the 1971 white paper, it was more about environment, pollution control.
Right. Different era.
Totally. The 94 paper barely mentioned Arctic defense, just the Rangers mostly. Then in the 2000s, policy focused on human security, environment. Even Harper's Northern Strategy, which was more assertive, and the 2019 framework didn't quite have this level of urgency about sovereignty that we see now in 2024.
So what's driving this new urgency according to the documents?
Our North, Strong and Free, points to three big connected trends. First, climate change, the Arctic's literally opening up. Second, challenges to the international order, specifically from China and Russia. And third, disruptive technologies changing the game.
Okay. And is the main worry acute military pressures, or is it broader than that, like national security in general?
That's a good question, and there seems to be a bit of debate. ONSF focuses heavily on Canadian Arctic sovereignty and security, but it's maybe less detailed about, say, NATO's northern flank or the European Arctic side of things.
So maybe a tension between national needs and international commitments, though you mentioned those talks with Germany and Norway.
Right. Those reported trilateral discussions suggest they are thinking about that wider context. It kind of makes you think about old principles, like St. Laurent's 1947 ideas about supporting international organizations and how that applies to NATO today.
And the Arctic foreign policy itself, what are its main pillars?
It outlines three core areas: asserting sovereignty, advancing Canadian interests, and promoting a stable, prosperous, secure North. Pretty clear goals.
And the biggest shift in the foreign policy seems to be how it talks about Russia.
Absolutely massive shift. In 2019, Russia was still kind of framed as a potential partner up there. Now, post-Ukraine invasion, it's explicitly an adversary.
Minister Jolie's comment about Russia having no red lines probably sums that up.
It does, and the document mentions Russia a lot. It's clearly the main perceived antagonist now in the Arctic context for Canada.
Even though the U.S. is still called the greatest ally in the Arctic.
Yeah, but the policy does acknowledge the uncertainty because of Trump's re-election. It's like, best ally, but we'll see.
And diplomatically, what's the AFP planning?
Key things include boosting presence, new consulates planned for Anchorage in Alaska and Nuuk in Greenland. Big focus on science security, research security, and continuing those boundary negotiations, like in the Beaufort Sea with the U.S., and sorting out Hans Island finally with Denmark.
What about China? The policy includes the North Pacific in the Arctic vision. That seems broader.
It is broader, and it's definitely linked to China. Their growing Arctic activity, their strategic cooperation with Russia, joint military exercises, that kind of thing. That's got Ottawa's attention.
So Canada's trying to build other partnerships too. Japan, South Korea.
Yeah, they're both Arctic Council observers, both concerned about the rules-based order. So reaching out to them makes strategic sense in this new environment.
So the AFP paints Russia as the main threat militarization, ignoring northern communities. But one of the analyses points out there's this Russian foreign policy consensus that sees the West as the threat.
Right. It mentions polling data showing Putin's support actually increases during invasions, suggesting a population that buys into this idea of an external threat. The CAFP tries to sort of separate Putin from the Russian people, but this analysis questions if that reflects the reality of that consensus view in Russia.
A consensus driven by things like NATO expansion, perceived Western encroachment.
Exactly. That's been a consistent theme in Russia's view for a long time, predating the full-scale Ukraine invasion. It's about balancing perceived Western power, maybe stoking divisions between allies.
So Canada ramps up military readiness in the Arctic NORAD modernization, emergency response. But the analysis notes the main high-tech threats are still aimed at the heartland, not necessarily the Arctic itself.
Primarily, yeah. Which leads to the tricky question of how or even if you engage with adversaries like Russia now.
What's the approach?
Well, Canada's ambassador in Moscow talks about limited engagement, trying to keep some lines open even in a really hostile atmosphere.
Yeah.
Because you have to talk, right?
It brings up that whole Cold War idea, doesn't it? Strategic codependency because of nuclear weapons. Even enemies had hotlines, arms control talks.
Exactly. There was a shared interest in avoiding catastrophe, which meant dialogue was essential even if you fundamentally disagreed. The current breakdown in communication is seen by some analysts as uniquely dangerous.
And some are even suggesting, like, informal Arctic talks with Russia eventually, post-Ukraine.
Yeah, just to try and rebuild some kind of communication channel in the region.
Okay, so summing up this part, Ukraine in competition with China are the big drivers for this renewed Arctic focus in both defense, ONSF, and foreign policy, AFP.
Definitely. ONSF talks great power conflict, protecting NATO flanks.
Yeah.
AFP gets into dual-use research, hybrid warfare, info ops.
And Canada's main response seems to be beefing up its presence, especially maritime. Those new patrol vessels, helicopters, sensors.
That seems to be the core of the capability enhancement. More eyes and ears, more ability to operate up there.
What about those Chinese research vessels? There was concern about them being dual purpose. How does the AFP handle that?
It takes a pretty nuanced approach, actually. It talks about reviewing research requests inside Canada's exclusive economic zone, but not seeking like an outright ban or exclusion.
More pragmatic, maybe?
Okay. And just to clarify, when we talk Arctic sovereignty, what exactly does that mean in this context? Good question. It has two sides, really. Internal sovereignty, Canada's authority within its own Arctic territory. And external sovereignty, its independence from other states. The UN Charter backs this up with the principle of sovereign equality.
So Canada's sovereignty isn't really questioned under international law. It's more about Canada's capacity to exercise that authority and independence in a changing environment.
Precisely. It's reaffirmed by the rules-based order. As thinkers like de Vattel pointed out ages ago, sovereignty isn't about size or power. A smaller nation has just as much authority within its borders. It's about upholding that principle.
So if we boil down the key challenges identified across these policies, what are they? An in vivo analysis mentioned in the sources pulled some out.
Yeah, the main themes that emerge are dealing with a more assertive Russia, managing the complex impacts of climate change and new technologies, and navigating increasing global instability, all hitting Canada's Arctic security.
And there's a link made to communities up north.
A very strong link. Resilient northern communities are seen as vital for Canada's defense. Plus, the military is getting pulled more and more into responding to climate disasters domestically, which stretches resources.
So upholding sovereignty and the rules-based order are the common threads through both policies.
Absolutely.
And the specific initiatives to boost capabilities. You mentioned sensors, helicopters. What else?
There's mention of a new satellite ground station, more all-terrain vehicles, setting up operational support hubs in the north. And on the diplomatic side, pushing Arctic Council engagement, involving indigenous peoples more, managing the Arctic Ocean based on rules.
But the giant elephant in the room, or maybe the moose, is Trump's inauguration in 2025. How does that change the game for these carefully laid plans?
Fundamentally, that's the crux of it. His rhetoric, challenging the whole rules-based order, even suggesting annexation, it just completely alters the assumptions these policies were built on.
It's different from China's challenge, isn't it? China might push boundaries or try to reshape rules, but it generally still operates within the existing international system.
Broadly speaking, yes. Whereas Trump's rhetoric questions the value of those institutions themselves from a U.S. perspective, which forces Canada, really, to think about becoming less reliant on the U.S. and that previously stable Western order.
One last area mentioned was messaging and framing. Canada doing stuff, but maybe not getting the word out.
Yeah, that seems to be a concern. Lack of coverage for Canadian involvement in big exercises, for example. Canada has a pretty capable defense industry, too. Companies like Top Aces, CAE, Kraken Robotics. But maybe their contributions to collective defense aren't always highlighted.
And even reporting on joint exercises, like with the U.S., tends to focus on your own country's part.
That's a common tendency, yeah. The recommendation there was to maybe boost funding for things like the Global Arctic Leadership Initiative, working more with civil society and Indigenous partners to strengthen Canada's voice and leadership image.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this deep dive up. The theme was Turning Tides, Canada's political shift and its global implications.
And we've definitely seen that. A major political shift internally, driven largely by a drastically changed, much more strained relationship with the U.S. under Trump's return.
Happening right alongside this much sharper focus on the Arctic sovereignty, security because of geopolitics, Russia, China, and of course, climate change melting the ice.
And these things aren't separate threads. They're tangled together. Domestic politics, foreign relations, Arctic strategy, it's all connected.
This turning tide really does seem to put Canada at a crossroads, asking some pretty fundamental questions about its role in the world.
Which leads to a final thought, really, for you listening. Given these huge shifts we've talked about, this tide turning in the U.S. relationship, the new Arctic focus, what kind of fundamental changes might we see in Canada's global identity and role in the next few years? What tough choices are lying ahead as Canada tries to navigate all this?
Definitely something to chew on. A lot changing and quickly.